Good evening and welcome to the Hindu Lit for Life Dialogue 2018. The event will begin shortly. A few points before we begin. Please put your mobile phones on silent mode and do not move around during the event as this may distract the speakers. The dialogue will be followed by a short Q&A session, so please keep your questions ready. Keep them short and relevant to the conversation. Mr. Tharoor will be available for book signing and interaction outside the auditorium after the event. And for those active on social media, please use the hashtag LFL Dialogue 2018 when posting, and do follow us on the Hindu Lit for Life page on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Also to note, the registrations for the main festival, the Hindu Lit for Life 2019, are now open. You can register at the registration desk outside the auditorium. Thank you.
Our celebrator's guests, Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi, jury members of the Hindu Prize, valued guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening. I have pleasure in welcoming you all this evening to the Hindu Lit for Life Dialogue 2018. The LFL lecture series is delivered annually by a distinguished speaker as a precursor to the Literature Festival in January each year. The series tries to engage with important issues of the day with talks that will expand the minds of the audience. In the earlier years, we have had historian Ramchandra Guha and Justice A.P. Shah deliver enlightening lectures as a part of the series. This year, in a deviation from the past, we bring you a dialogue between two inspiring and brilliant thinkers, Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi, who will deliberate on the opportunities and challenges before India. The shortlist of the Hindu Prize 2018 will be announced after the dialogue. The Hindu Prize for Fiction was instituted in 2010 to recognize and encourage Indian writing in English. This year, the Hindu introduces a prize for non-fiction in various genres. The winners are announced at the Lit for Life in Chennai in January 2019. I would like to welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor, Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi, and Dr. Nirmala Lakshman to the stage.
I was about to say that Chennai must be the only place in India where we actually begin a function ahead of time. You notice it's only 5 to 6.
I now invite Dr. Nirmala Lakshman, Director, the Hindu Group, and Director Lit for Life, to give her opening remarks.
Thank you, Shalini. Good evening. The Hindu is very glad to welcome you all to the third edition of the annual Lit for Life Dialogue and Lecture Series, which is a pivotal forerunner to the 3-day literary festival, which we hold in Chennai in January each year. The Hindu's Literature Festival, Lit for Life, is a natural and active complement to a newspaper of record, which over the past 140 years has tried to reflect with credibility and consistency the best and most inclusive democratic values of this nation. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor, former Union Minister, current Member of Parliament, and award-winning author. Dr. Tharoor has written numerous books of fiction and non-fiction, including 2 recently highly acclaimed books which have shed new and interesting light on important subjects. An Era of Darkness, How the British Empire Fell, and Why I Am a Hindu. I'm sure the ideas from his writing will be discussion points today. Earlier, Dr. Tharoor has served with great distinction at the highest levels of administration in the United Nations as Under Secretary General. He's also written extensively in the Indian media, including in the Hindu. He will be in dialogue this evening with Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi, currently Professor of History and Politics at Ashoka University. Mr. Gandhi, as many of us in Chennai know only too well, is a distinguished author, thinker, and administrator who was formerly the governor of West Bengal. And he has headed several diplomatic missions in different countries abroad. His published works include novels, plays, and translations, recently including the very highly popular Tirukkural, and he has also edited works such as the letters between his illustrious grandfathers, C. Rajagopalachari and Mahatma Gandhi. He also writes for The Hindu and several other newspapers. Mr. Gandhi was the recipient of the Rajiv Gandhi Sadbhavana Award this year, apart, of course, from other awards that were conferred on him earlier. I warmly welcome them both and believe that we can do no better than to have two such fine minds converse and engage in an enlightening discussion about the issues and opportunities in India today, a topic that is of crucial importance to all of us as concerned citizens. The idea of this annual series is to explore and engage with current critical issues and shine a new light on important subjects from thinkers and public intellectuals like Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Gandhi, whose work and voices have influenced and affected the way we see and understand things. At a time when core democratic principles on which this republic was founded are under assault, when divisiveness and sectarianism are blatantly supported by those in positions of authority, and when intimidation and violence are used to silence and stifle dissent, it becomes imperative, especially for us in the media, to highlight and discuss these trends and speak truth to power. We know that this evening's dialogue will enhance our perceptions of the topics that they will both discuss, be it on definitions of religion, on individual and human rights, the threats to our democratic institutions, to our constitution even, and the flouting of the rule of law, and perhaps too, the opportunities that exist for us as a citizenry to change things. Such conversations will surely catalyze further constructive thinking on these ideas, and it is a privilege to have these two distinguished individuals exchange ideas in our presence. After the dialogue, we'll also announce the shortlist for the Hindu Prize for the Best Book of the Year in Fiction, and for the very first time, a shortlist for the Best Book of the Year in Non-Fiction. While the winners will be announced at the festival in January, we believe that it's important to recognize great writing. So a shortlist is also very vital as it showcases a range of ideas that emerge from a wellspring of creativity, be it in fiction or nonfiction, encapsulating and documenting essential human experience. I warmly welcome the two jury panels comprised of distinguished writers, intellectuals, and thinkers who will reveal the shortlist of the best fiction and nonfiction books. I cannot thank them enough for their support and efforts, spending weeks and months carefully and painstakingly reading scores of books and arriving at their lists independently without any involvement from the Hindu. We look forward now to an enlightening discussion between Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Gandhi, which will undoubtedly expand our horizons and the boundaries of our minds. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Nirmala. I now request Dr. Nirmala Lakshman to present the mementos to our guests.
Thank you, Nirmala. Thank you.
Dr. Tharoor, Mr. Gandhi, the floor is now yours.
I'm not sure whether this is working. I think it is working, yes. It doesn't say so here on the board behind our stage, but on the card it says Shashi Tharoor in conversation with Gopal Krishna Gandhi. Now, normally, an older person is in conversation with a younger person. And a septuagenarian is entitled to sit very wisely and respond to questions from a younger person. But Shashi Tharoor is Shashi Tharoor. Gopal Gandhi is Gopal Gandhi. And I know that most of you have heard this fellow citizen resident of Chennai many times, but the opportunity to hear Shashi Tharoor comes rarely. And so I welcome you on behalf of our city to this event today.
That is so gracious of you. That is truly gracious of you, Gopal. I must say that I'm the loser because I would have enjoyed listening to Gopal Krishna Gandhi at greater length than he seems to be prepared to allow himself. But you do have the advantage that he is amongst you all the time, and I'm not. So I will be happy to bear the larger portion of the conversational burden if you so wish.
Thank you, Shashi. I just want to share a thought with you and with everyone present here, which is this, that we are gathered here today to join in a conversation. And after a few minutes of our conversation, Shashi's and mine, we will open the discussion to everyone present.
Sure.
But essentially, this is not a seminar. So I can't, at least in speaking for myself, divide issues into political, social, economic, legal. But I would like to discuss issues with you, Shashi, and place a few thoughts and questions before you. From the point of view of what is uppermost in the minds of our people today, what is engaging India's thought today, what are the concerns and worries. And I'll just put it this way, as a starter, has hypocrisy become accepted as the swarupam of politics? Has corruption been accepted as the swabhava of governance? And has inefficiency been interiorized by us as the norm of administration? This is an issue, and I want you to respond to this.
It's hard to point fingers, of course, without pointing more fingers at oneself. And I think we are all, to some degree, complicit in the undoubted truth of what you've said. Hypocrisy, corruption, and inefficiency. Gosh, that's quite an indictment, Gopal. But yes, hypocrisy. I remember my father telling me when I was 10 years old that we are not just the world's largest democracy, we are the world's largest hypocrisy. And I keep finding myself applying his wisdom to various situations, and particularly, I think, to the extraordinary gap between the lip service that is paid and the practices that are followed. And the most recent example was yesterday, when our Prime Minister tweeted a condolence message to the man who had died by fasting unto death in protest against his failure to fulfill his promises in cleaning up the Ganga. And I mean, if irony didn't sort of disappear from the cyberspace sphere at that point, I don't know what else could have typified that. As for corruption, it has been grossly embedded. It's become chronic, and it's also become epidemic, which I know is, I'm sure for the doctors in the audience, a contradiction in terms, but it is so. Having grown up in an India which was still relatively free of this, and then gone off to study in graduate school in the States in the mid-1970s, and then having come back almost 3 decades later to find myself in a country where literally every transaction appeared to require some extra consideration, and no Indian citizen could truly claim to have been untouched by corruption, and of course governance totally soiled by it, was a very rude awakening to what had happened to our society. And as for inefficiency, I'm afraid I am going to get a bit political and say that the last 4.5 years have completely borne that out, because if anything, this government was elected because it successfully characterized the previous one as inefficient, as bound up in policy paralysis and so on, and there was an expectation of swift and decisive action, which might have given the lie to those of us who thought that our government and our governance was doomed to be inefficient. Well, sadly, there's been so little action, so little implementation, so little connection between rhetoric and delivery, that inefficiency seems to be one of the best explanations available. So I'm afraid you score a tick mark on all three terms.
I must say, I agree with your analysis. But I must also say that for every major disappointment with this government, we can find a shining precedent in the UPA too, and in earlier governments. How can you, as an extremely objective and mature observer of events, apart from being a politician and a full-time politician from the Congress ranks, how can you reconcile this dichotomy that we must oppose what needs to be opposed now, but will that opposition today not be strengthened by a simultaneous owning up of past mistakes? Saying, for instance, if we are talking of hypocrisy, to say that what happened in Gujarat in 2002 was abominable, but what happened in Delhi in 1984 was appalling, and we are responsible for it. One example. There can be others. But will not the opposition today strengthen its moral voltage if it were to say, we have been guilty ourselves, and so we have a certain responsibility to acknowledge our guilt? We do so now, and thereby seek to retrieve the right to criticize you.
I agree entirely. In fact, I mean, I'm a relative newcomer to the world of full-time politics, having joined it only in 2009. But in my sort of previous life, even though as a UN official there were some restraints on how much I could and couldn't say, I was pretty outspoken on some of these issues, and I condemned 84 when it happened, and I condemned the Babri Masjid demolition when that happened. And I risked a certain amount of official disapproval in taking both positions, and I'm proud that I've been consistent about that. But if you ask me to speak for the Congress as a party, I would say the one redeeming answer to your question is that the Congress has demonstrated a capacity to learn from its mistakes. If the party that built up the mammoth license permit quota Raj that your grandfather rightly decried has become the party of liberalization, if the party that imposed the emergency has become one of the best custodians of liberal democracy, if the party that, let's face it, at the very least was asleep at the switch when 84 happened and 1,000-odd Sikhs were killed, has now become one of the best custodians of pluralist values, then it offers hope that whatever failings you feel have been prefigured in previous Congress regimes will not be repeated, because this is an establishment or a party or a leadership that has had experience of learning from its mistakes. I would still contest the argument that everything that's gone wrong in this government had gone wrong in the past. I think that's not entirely accurate. I mean, you might find a parallel between Rafale and Bofors or whatever, I don't know. I mean, there could be various arguments made about some of the more egregious failures of the present government having occurred earlier. But I would say there are many things that this government has done which previous Congress governments have been sensible enough not to do. I mean, the disastrous demonetization, for example, was the typical kind of one-man decision or made by a handful of people behind closed doors that the Congress would never take because it functions differently. There is a process of consultation. The cabinet was taken seriously. Its collective responsibility was respected. Institutions were trusted. The Reserve Bank had a certain autonomy. The chief economic advisor actually was allowed to give advice, none of which happened in the case of this government decreeing demonetization. If you look at other examples of this government's misbehavior, the Congress did come up with the Aadhaar concept, but came up with it as a way of guaranteeing identification for poor people who are beneficiaries of government transfers, of government assistance. The present government instead extended that into a massive national intrusion on the civil liberties and privacy of Indian citizens, including obliging the Aadhaar to be linked to a number of activities that had nothing to do with government benefits, from your mobile phones to your bank accounts. which suggested that a certain taste, if you like, for a big brother approach to governance, which is absent in the Congress. We have seen a level of intimidation of the free press in this country that I think, in all fairness, whatever the sins of previous regimes, you never saw under the UPA or the Congress governments, because they knew that taking criticism on the chin was part of the game of democracy, and arguably the negative press that the UPA endured, full bore, I might add, in the last few years of its reign, contributed in no small measure to its defeat. Whereas here you have a situation where exposés of misdeeds by prominent members of the government or their families suddenly disappear overnight from the websites of so-called mainstream publications, where editors find themselves losing their jobs when they dare to publish something called a hate tracker that tracks communal violence, and the day after they're fired, the hate tracker disappears. When journalists who file reports critical of the ruling party on Hindi television are suddenly obliged to resign after having had distinguished careers. When tax raids are conducted in the homes of the proprietors and editors of social media, I mean, basically websites, the Quint is the one I'm talking about most recently, that have attacked the government, and so on and so forth. These point to a pattern of intolerance of dissent, which I would argue did not exist in the Congress and the UPA. We can find other examples, but I would forbear from acquiescing in your description that everything this government has done wrong has been done before. This is a new order of wrongness that we are seeing in the last few years.
Your forbearance is welcome. Your forbearance is respected. And I must also say, for the sake of record, that Shashi Tharoor and I have not had the benefit of a powwow before we met here.
That's
so
true.
Our conversation is entirely spontaneous and is therefore likely to have many deficiencies in my part of it. Spontaneity, I think, is much more important, as indeed openness and frankness is important in a discussion of this kind.
Sure.
I must now go back to the comparative analysis that you made, Shashi. It is very important, and I accept your very civilized and gentle rebuke to me about putting the two on par. No, I accept that. I do not put them on par at all. I must, however, ask you why it is that the Congress and the UPA, which did not do anything visible or persuasive to install the Lokpal, and in fact did everything that was possible to prolong the process until Anna Hazare made it a flashpoint issue. Why is it that today, on the technicality of the leader of the Congress party not being invited as leader of the opposition on the selection panel, why is it on technicality of it, stopping the Lokpal from happening? Isn't it more important that we should have a Lokpal and allay public's anxieties about corruption? Isn't that more important than the prestige of who represents the Congress and the opposition in the panel?
Two things to that, Gopal. First, on your characterization of what happened in the lead up to the creation of the Lokpal, let's not forget it was the UPA that actually passed the Lokpal bill. Granted, we didn't do it immediately as soon as it was asked for, because there were many genuine misgivings about the wisdom of having such a humongous institution as Anna Hazare had conceived it, with sort of plenipotentiary powers over all arms of governance, and genuine concern that this could end up actually paralyzing governance even more. But as the sort of fever pitch of protest rose as high as it did, I think there was a political conclusion drawn that this cannot be resisted without seeming to be doing so out of desire to protect the corrupt, and therefore the Congress gave in and steamrolled the Lokpal bill through Parliament. Thereafter, as you know, we have a party with a humongous majority in the Lok Sabha that could have very easily gone ahead if it so wished. Now, the law does require the leader of the opposition to be invited. The leader of the opposition doesn't exist for the sound reason that the voters of India chose not to give us the numbers that would qualify us to have a representative with that title. Why have we not acquiesced in a process taking place without a leader of the opposition? Simply because we have very solid grounds to suspect the bona fides of the BJP's approach. And if we end up, as a result, with a Lokpal who is subservient to the government of the day, it might be worse than having no Lokpal at all. Let's also stress that the BJP has demonstrated an extraordinary capacity in the last few years to hollow out the institutions that do exist. If you look, for example, at the RTI Act. The RTI Act had grown under the 2 terms of the UPA since it was established into a very powerful instrument for the common citizenry to extract information from government. What we have seen under the BJP is a combination of delays in appointing information commissioners, delays in responding to inquiries, and the allowing of the commissioners to pile up an absurd backlog that in practice makes it impossible to use the RTI for as effective a tool of governance as one could at one time, because now what's happening is that you may file something that will lead you to take a particular stand, let's say, in a forthcoming state assembly election or in the next session of parliament or in a pending court case, and 6 months later you might not even have a reply. So these are all ways in which you hollow out the entire mechanism of the right to information. So there's some real concerns about how such a government would actually implement the Lokpal. And I think our feeling is that we do want to have a strong, constitutionally mandated voice in the selection of a truly unimpeachable person, in the absence of which we may as well stay out of the process.
But would participation in the selection process not include the right to step aside, to issue a dissenting voice, but at least be seen to be participating in setting up the Lokpal?
No, that's a fair question, and I think you must remember that that option was only offered very recently. In the first 2 or 3 years, I think, of the BJP's term, it was quite simply that there is no leader of the opposition, so the selection committee can't meet. They finally, I think, after some pressure, came around to the position, okay, you can send someone, but he will not have the stature of the leader of the opposition. But you can certainly have somebody come and sit in the meetings. We don't know with what powers. Since the law doesn't recognize such an individual, we don't know with what powers he will be able to have a voice, and whether, if indeed there is an attempt made to steamroll a relatively objective or impartial figure in that position, whether at that point our non-leader of the opposition stepping back will have any impact, either legally or morally. I think now that we've come to within 6 months of the election, I'm not even sure it makes much sense to give the BJP a Lokpal of its choice. We may as well wait and see if the electorate decides to have a different government, we'll have a different Lokpal too.
Fair enough. I think there is no doubt that your party and your leaders have the nation's interest at mind in taking all these decisions. But the prerogative to make mistakes is hugged by the Congress very consistently. And I would say one example which struck me as being very unfortunate, as somebody who wants to see the Congress do better and better, was its decision to impeach the then Chief Justice of India. And to go ahead with the idea of impeachment when we found that in certain very important cases, the same Chief Justice gave us orders which we would have expected to come from a Chief Justice of the most sterling quality and caliber and capacity. Is it possible that opposing for the sake of opposing is a cap that fits the Congress?
No. First of all, let me say on this particular instance, it was a decision of certain colleagues in the Rajya Sabha, and I, being in the Lok Sabha, was neither party to them nor involved in any of the discussion. So everything I tell you will be second-hand. My understanding is that some of them had very serious concerns about the Chief Justice's impartiality, which I think were accentuated by the extraordinary act of 4 Supreme Court justices going public in January, and this may have triggered a wish on the part of some colleagues to take this action. At the same time, other colleagues, also in the Rajya Sabha, were taking the not unreasonable view that since the very first step that is required in an impeachment is the assent of the Vice President, and the Vice President being who he is, and from the party he comes from, is extremely unlikely to assent, even if every one of your fears is well-founded, some colleagues said, why bother? And how does it help to antagonize the very man who in any case will survive and you'll have to deal with until October? So this was the discussion. I was, as I said, not part of it, and I was not privy to the basis on which one option was chosen over the other. But exactly that happened. That is, that the impeachment notice was sent, and it was not assented to by the Vice President. That was the end of the story. And you're right that some subsequent decisions have been welcomed by those like you and me of a liberal bent of mind, even though many of us had feared that this was an illiberal tendency that the court was going to be supporting. So having said that, I would say, looking back on what happened, that we actually have had a pretty interesting year in the Supreme Court. In fact, going back to the middle of last year with the right to privacy, which was an extraordinary judgment, and carrying on towards a number of areas which have expanded our understanding of our constitutional freedoms. And as somebody who, for example, tried unsuccessfully to decriminalize consenting sexual activity between adults by decriminalizing Section 377, on the grounds that this is not about sex but about freedom, and that the government has no place in the bedrooms of the nation, nor indeed does it have a place in the kitchens of the nation, but that may be another issue. The fact is that the court reversed a previous ruling of the same court, of the Supreme Court, and took the enlightened view. Many in this auditorium may not share the view that the adultery provision should have been decriminalized, but the reasoning behind that decriminalization was extremely sound and upheld certain principles of equality and dignity of human beings who happen to be women, far, far more than one might have expected. So you're seeing a certain liberal direction coming out of the court that certainly is well worth applauding. I have to say, however, we've also had this court sort of betraying 4,000 years of Indian civilizational history by refusing asylum to 7 Rohingyas and allowing our government to deport refugees to a country where instantly they were arrested as soon as they landed, which is a violation of every decent principle of international humanitarian law, the long-standing principle of non-refoulement, and which means non-involuntary return, and of course also of the long traditions we've had going back to the havens we've given to the Jews fleeing the destruction of their temple by the Babylonians, all the way down to the Parsis who sought refuge here, people from all over the regions, in more recent years, the Tibetans, the Bangladeshis themselves, the Sri Lankan Tamils. We've allowed all sorts of people to come and seek refuge here when they needed to. But this time, we have a government that looks at the religion of asylum seekers and expels them, and our Supreme Court shamefully acquiesced in it. So I wouldn't just sit here and give a complete carte blanche sort of certificate of good housekeeping to the Supreme Court, but I would say that on balance, they've had more good decisions than bad ones in recent times.
Given the fact that the independence of institutions has been for very long a matter of great concern in India, and has been more and more so in the recent past, the orders of the Supreme Court of India in recent cases, starting of course with the right to privacy, have, I think, rekindled great hopes and expectations in us of the Supreme Court and indeed of the judiciary itself. And here I would like to also remind everyone present here that Shashi's comments on Rohingyas have to be also seen in the background of his phenomenal experience in the High Commission for Refugees, the UN High Commission for Refugees. And it comes from deep knowledge of what is happening across the world. I want to say here that I was not a little disappointed, Shashi, when you made a somewhat pointed and somewhat pointless criticism of Sushma Swaraj's speech in the United Nations. I think it would have been very becoming of somebody who's been so high up in the United Nations and who has been a Minister of State for External Affairs to have probably just made a little comment on the disproportionate reference to our Prime Minister in her speech. But to have gone on and on about Sushma Swaraj's lack of perspective, I thought was unnecessary from one of your stature.
Thank you. I didn't realize it had gone on and on. In fact, the first time it came was when one of these ubiquitous TV cameras showed up on my doorstep and asked me to comment on the speech. And I just said that, look, I thought it was a political speech aimed at her voters here and really not about, not a speech for the UN podium. And that's all I said. And I thought it would rest there because it was expressed in fairly mild language. To my surprise, the BJP chose to go after me at their official press conference 2 days later and made me out to be some sort of sympathizer of Pakistan because I'd criticized a speech in which our minister had attacked Pakistan. So then I pointed out in a tweet, so that's why I'm saying going on and on is difficult when you're confined to 280 characters. I said in a tweet, it's a bit rich, was the word I used, for the BJP to attack me for decrying Sushma Swaraj's political speech from the UN platform. For instance, she mentioned Narendra Modi 10 times, and India, on whose behalf she was supposed to speak, just 5 times. So it seemed to me that, if you are going to use the UN as a political platform, you really can't hide behind the flag. Now, that was the sum total of all I said, Gopal. If you think that went on and on, I apologize through you to the nation.
Well, 280 characters don't amount to going on and on. But when those 280 characters are seen by 8 million followers, then there is a certain volume that you achieve. But that apart, I think using the United Nations platform for what can be called a semi-political or even a political or a party line was started by one of your very distinguished predecessors, Krishna Menon, whose marathon speech in the United Nations was not meant to convince the United Nations about India's position in Kashmir as much as it was meant to influence the voters of North Bombay. So Sushma Swaraj has certain precedence to go
I think
back.
He still holds the record for the longest speech ever made of the UN.
He does.
In the midst of which he collapsed in a faint at one point and had to be taken to hospital. The meeting was adjourned and resumed the next morning with him continuing in full flow. Yeah. So that is going to be a hard act to follow, even for Sushma ji.
Yeah, that is going to be a very hard act to follow, and I don't think she should follow that part of Krishna Menon's precedent. But I must say here also, Shashi, that it's quite wonderful that in 2 or 3 of your observations this evening, you have so clearly stated that you are not entirely with a certain line of thinking, or you are not privy to a certain line of thinking of your party, and this only shows how important it is for a party to have at least this much of leeway, this much of possibility to differ, this much of a chance, a scope to say a slightly different thing or the same thing in a slightly different way, something which the ruling dispensation today just does not permit. Your party, your government was not and is not a party of invertebrates led by a monocratic leader. That is for sure. And
well
I think
said.
for that,
thank you.
one has to give history its credit. But I am saying this not just because we both seem to have, or I really do have, similar perspectives on most political matters, but also because I think being a devil's advocate is sometimes very good for the other party, in this case, you. I would also say here, Shashi, that in recent years, the level of political debate and discussion in our country, which is another issue of our times, an issue of India, has degenerated to such an extent that people of my generation are left aghast at the decline. Where has democratic courtesy and the civility of conversation disappeared? Is it possible, do you think, in the coming elections for your party, which is wedded to a culture of give and take, in a cricketing sense, is it possible for you to resist reacting with the same coin, giving back to your opponent in the same manner in which you will get it? Will you resist that temptation and keep your stature?
It's a tough one, Gopal, because to be honest, to some degree, we have already lost that particular battle. We have been reacting in terms just as unpleasant, shall we say, as the
That's
as the
another
BJP has resorted
another
to.
very important, shall I say, admission.
Well, I think it's partly unavoidable. I think we've got to a stage where not only has the BJP's initiative in this regard coarsened our political discourse, but a failure to respond in kind would be seen as weakness by our own supporters and by those whom we need to appeal to. It's very striking that on many issues, one finds that the Congress party, when it takes what would seem otherwise to be a very reasonably strong opposition stand, is accused by its own well-wishers of not having been robust enough. And that's partly because the yardstick for what is a robust attack has really been laid down by the BJP and by its own Prime Minister when he was in the opposition. So it becomes difficult, and I think it would be idle of me to pretend that we will sort of be extremely gentlemanly while we're being kicked below the belt on every second occasion by the other side. And I share with you the concern that this is most unfortunate. I've written about this myself, as I'm sure you have in the past, that we do really need to get beyond the levels to which our politics has descended, because ultimately, once a government is chosen, we all have to work with it. The choice of the people has to be respected, and that means that those, in any case, who have been given by the voters the custodianship of the nation's assets and responsibilities are entitled to exercise, if you like, the authority that comes with it, and we are obliged to recognize that authority. I think, Rahul Gandhi did say that once in Parliament, that, when he said something about Mr. Modi addressing the BJP benches, and he said, "Your Prime Minister," and they shouted back at him, he immediately corrected himself, said, "No, he's my Prime Minister too."
Oh, that's excellent.
And I think that is well, Rahul was so wise that he said, "Yes, he is my Prime Minister, but he's not the Prime Minister of the farmers and the workers," which was a good political comeback. But he did concede the first point, that he is the Prime Minister of all Indians. And I think we have to accept that that in this case, it ill behooves a democracy like ours for the discourse to be so cheapened that people holding ministerial office are busy insulting their opponents and people of other persuasions. I really would love to see it change, but I wouldn't be as much of a chronic optimist as I am. I wouldn't be confident that I could see where that change is going to come from, because the people who are now busy abusing each other are the ones who will have to continue to lay down the terms of that discourse in the next few months leading up to the elections.
I think when the BJP and its leader had once spoken of a Congress-free India, Congress-Mukt India, the Congress reacted almost reflexively and in what can be called mime, to say that we are wanting a BJP-Mukt India, BJP-free India. This was not only unoriginal, but it was also very unfortunate. And I think it's very good that Rahul Gandhi said that, no, we do not want a BJP-Mukt India. BJP must have its place, must have its democratic space. And I think he added that we would like that space to be in the opposition. And
That's
so
right.
that is an important,
but in
important lesson.
fact, the actual polemic on that is indicative of a certain mindset, which is that we do have in the ruling party an exclusionary mindset, a willingness to exclude, whether it's a party, whether it's a minority, whether it's certain groups whom they don't consider congenial, whereas the Congress propensity has always been to include everybody. And sometimes one would even argue illogically, that is that, for example, on economic policy, we have extreme free marketers and convinced and self-declared Marxists all under the same big tent. But that inclusiveness is part of what the Congress has always been about, and is certainly not at all part of the DNA of the ruling party.
I would like to say here, in a slight rewinding of our conversation, that the Supreme Court's orders in several cases recently have, as I said, restored our optimism and our faith in the institutions. But what are we going to do, and what would you like to see being done about the erosion of institutions such as education institutions, institutions of higher learning, where systematically the architecture is being changed to bring in people with a particular political ideology, with a particular political background, which will not only corrode the integrity and the autonomy of those institutions, but in fact have a very long impact on the kind of work that those institutions are doing, academic work, institutional work amongst intellectuals and amongst beneficiaries of government and non-governmental schemes which these institutions are studying. So a great issue today in India, which is so completely mixed up with the opportunities that are available in India, is the role of independent autonomous institutions, which are in great danger of subversion and co-option. And I want your response as one of India's leading intellectuals, writers, and academics.
Well, I share your concern, Gopal, and in spades. I mean, there are two specific things. First, I have actually no problem with any government, for any appointment within its jurisdiction, appointing people it finds politically congenial, provided they are otherwise qualified. The problem is that it appears in many of these cases that the only qualification that these appointees possess is loyalty to a particular cause, and then specifically to the RSS, and that their lack of any other academic substantial pedigree casts, I'm afraid, doubt on their fitness for the offices to which they've been appointed. In other words, I think it's entirely appropriate if there is an RSS scholar with a number of publications in peer-reviewed journals and so on, who is appointed to a particular academic position, that you may not like his politics, but he has the qualifications and the experience and the publications and the citations to be therefore in that position. I don't think we have a right to object. Frankly, when the left has come to power in Bengal, they've done the same, or in Kerala. When the Congress was in power in Delhi, people of a liberal disposition found it easier, etc. So that is in and of itself not wrong. But the person has to be otherwise qualified, and sadly, in all too many cases, they have not been. To many, many institutions, universities, academic institutions, Indian councils of this and that, we've seen a problem. The second aspect, unfortunately, is the mentality that has come along with this. You rightly said that many universities are now changing from what they were meant to be. It seems to me that nothing could be more embarrassing than Jawaharlal Nehru University's vice-chancellor asking for a tank to be parked in his campus in order to instill feelings of patriotism amongst the students, which I think is one of the most appalling decisions made by a university vice-chancellor in recent memory. It's even worse when we have an announcement yesterday, I think it was, that no one earning a salary from the UGC, in other words, pretty much every university in the country, other than the handful of private universities, may publish anything critical of the government. Now, how can a scholar on foreign policy, for example, write objectively about Indian foreign policy if he chooses to be critical of what the government has done in foreign policy? How can a scholar of rural development studying the effectiveness of a particular rural development program write freely if it's now against his rules of service to be able to do so? It is a blatant attempt at censorship being brought in by a government that clearly has no respect for free speech or for free thought. And to my mind, that is what's fundamentally dangerous about all of this. As I say, I have no problem with a right-winger heading a university today if he's otherwise qualified, and no doubt one day he'll make way for somebody of a different political persuasion. But I have fundamental problems when the consequences of such appointments are absurdities like the tank and surgical strikes day being celebrated on campuses, and then the the promulgation of rules that make it impossible for scholars in a wide variety of fields to do their jobs effectively because they are no longer allowed to express views that may be critical of the government that now considers itself their paymaster. I must say, in all fairness to the UPA and the Congress, we never thought of ourselves that way. The taxpayers' money is a trust. We are handing it over to professors to teach according to their qualifications and their own lights, and that's what had happened. There was never any attempt to muzzle freedom of thought on campuses until this government came along.
I want to move, Shashi, before we open the discussion to the House in a very few minutes. I want to ask you what can be called a conceptual question about your politics and the politics of your party and the tradition of the Congress. Party is bigger than politics, politics is bigger than country, is a formula which everybody accepts and everybody believes in. But I just want to ask, in the present situation politically in India, when we have a party that is using the processes of democracy, especially the process of electoral democracy, to bring into office and power a system that is essentially intolerant of dissent, of democratic opposition. And that is the situation. Is it time for the Congress to reflect on its own equations with the other democratic opposition parties and say that we are the GOP, yes, and we have been led by X, Y, Z leaders of millennial stature. But now it is time for us in the Congress to recognize the importance of regional impulses, of provincial parties, of state parties, and not say, now you take the lead, we follow you, no, but that we are not now saying hereafter for the next election that, okay, we give you this, you take this, because that is just not going to work. And I'm very specifically asking whether in the interests of saving our democratic possibilities, of our democratic choices, would the Congress consider in Delhi, for instance, saying, AAP may have made many mistakes. Arvind Kejriwal may be a person who is open to the charge of being egotistical, but he has led a huge initiative and wrested power in the national capital territory of India. And I think we should not oppose AAP. Likewise. In Kerala, in your own state, whether the left or the Congress win, their opposition, the MP from Kerala will be an MP on the side of democracy and against the BJP. But would it not be, for instance, and this is a direct question, your seat, for instance, is a CPI seat, right? Would there not be some huge spasm of happiness in the democratic circles of India if the Congress were to say, in the state assembly elections in Kerala, we are going to fight it out. But in the elections to the Lok Sabha, let us divide our seats equitably and fight from the same side to not let a single vote go to the non-democratic party.
Gopal, I think you're now betraying that you're not a politician. On your first part of your question, to be honest, I can't answer it because that's not my role in the party. I don't quite know what discussions are taking place. All I can say is that very clearly state units have their own views on relationships with other parties in the state, and they will be taken very seriously into account, whether it's Delhi, whether it's Bengal, whether it's Kerala. And clearly the political parties exist to win elections. And if it so happens that in a particular state, their principal opponent happens to be a party which is otherwise congenial on the national issues that the BJP helps us define, Nonetheless, no party will voluntarily relinquish its own space, because ultimately you have to keep your party workers motivated. You have to have principles you care for enough to defend. I mean, we are not communists, and therefore we're not going to lightly give up a seat to the Communist Party. And you have to understand that it's not that we are reluctant to make adjustments. I think Exhibit A is what happened in Karnataka, where despite having more than double the seats that the JDS had, we offered the chief ministership to the JDS in order to create a strong, robust coalition that could keep out the BJP. And to my mind, this is a very interesting augury of the way in which the Congress is approaching the entire question of opposition politics. I have always been a little skeptical about the idea of a national coalition. The Mahagathbandhan, cut across all states. I mean, in my own state, in my own constituency, I know that when Sharad Pawar's NCP was allied with us in Delhi, the NCP was allied with the Left Front in Kerala and was therefore opposed to me. So in these circumstances, you accept the idea that there are state politics, there's national politics, and this will differ. But I think with a combination of some pre-poll alliances in some states, where they're feasible and where they're necessary, I think UP is a very good example, Bihar is another, where pre-poll alliances are the only way for the opposition to ensure a good result, and a combination of post-poll alliances, that is, people we've fought against during the Lok Sabha elections, but have more in common with than we or they have with the BJP. With that kind of combination, we should be able to come up with a credible, convincing opposition alternative to whatever remains of the BJP in 2019. And I say whatever remains, I think if some of the discussions that are already taking place in opposition unity fructify, I think the BJP is going to be pretty devastatingly affected in the 2019 elections.
I'd like to say here that I heard a Roman Catholic priest say that he has heard in the confession box every conceivable crime and sin confessed except one, and that is jealousy. Envy and jealousy are not easily owned and acknowledged. Now, jealousy is a very important factor in Indian politics. Envy,
don't I know it?
rivalry, very important factor. I think you mentioned party cadres have to be kept motivated. Now, party cadres' motivation is a euphemism for a whole range of arrangements made by a party to keep its power centers going. Mutual rivalries between members of the same party are being used now in elections increasingly. And those who do not get tickets from a particular party are helped to stand as independent candidates. Not because they will win, but because they divide the votes. Now, in a situation like this, how will the larger vision be protected by the Congress? How will the Congress overcome the issue of rivalry and intra-party jealousies? In other words, Congress's whole problem of factionalism, how will it handle that before this huge and critical task of taking on autocracy?
I'm afraid the answer is we probably will never quite surmount it, because it's
what
endemic.
An honest answer. I think that needs an applause.
Well, I'll add to it that I think the BJP also has problems. It's just that they are more ruthlessly suppressed. The public expression of them is more ruthlessly
That is called
suppressed.
a quick recovery.
But in every state we seem to have this phenomenon. It's partly the result of the whole big tent phenomenon. When you have so many qualified people and so many able leaders, each of whom does not have a particularly modest estimate of his or her own qualities and fitness for high office, inevitably perhaps factions and groups will follow. But the extent to which these factions sometimes seem more important to individual members then the interests of the collective party is what's dismaying. And I have come across far too many Congress candidates who lost elections because their own party men betrayed them as they felt, and far too many cases in which sometimes a compromise between two factions gave you a rather hopeless outcome, rather than simply the best thing for the party being pursued, whether it's in choice of candidate, whether it's in choice of policy, whether it's in certain steps that the parties in our countries are able to take. So the short answer is factionalism is there. The challenge has got to be to rise above it on the basis of principles, and that's ground where I think you and I would find ourselves in agreement, that as long as both factions subscribe to certain core values, then and the difference between them is essentially one of ego, then egos can be satisfied in one way or the other through either election or appointment. Buggin's turn will always come, but it's only when a party is divided fundamentally on issues of principle or ideology that one really needs to worry. And I would say in Congress, the factionalism I've seen, even if once upon a time there had been ideological type factions, as we saw, for example, in my state of Kerala, today I would say that all those have become irrelevant. You'll find people in either faction in Kerala or in one of the three factions in one of the other states, I should name it. They essentially all coalesce around the same set of principles, the same approach to politics, but they owe their loyalty to one particular leader rather than another. And that is difficult to just shake off. It doesn't happen. People don't suddenly become altruistic overnight and step back and sacrifice the positions they feel they're qualified for and give them to someone else. But change does come. And what's interesting in the history of our country is that very, very few people have actually been able to maintain a monopoly over power anywhere, either at the state level or the national level. Change comes, voters wake up, even parties decide to move on from a particular leader, and I think that will ultimately be, the strength of democracy has always been that it's a self-correcting mechanism. We too will correct ourselves.
I think the time has come for us to widen our discussion to concepts or to very important issues, one of which is, nationally speaking, the question of dissent, the security of dissent, not just the right to, but the sheer physical security of dissent. And I think the democratic opposition, and this is now not just a Congress matter, but the democratic opposition across the country has been extraordinarily agile and extraordinarily eloquent in speaking up for the security of dissent. And that is something which we have to be very thankful about. And there lies an opportunity in that political cohesion of the democratic opposition of India, lies the opportunity for a retrieval of our republic, nothing less than that. The other great issue in the country today is polarization, connected to which is the issue of fighting terrorism. Because terrorism is just a reality of our times, but is also something which is used continuously by both sides to perpetuate and intensify polarization. I want to ask you, Shashi, now as a historian, because you've written on historical matters, made a big mark in your Oxford speech as a student of history, though I must say that some of your comments criticizing the Raj seemed to me to be like an Amina or a bailiff coming up to an old debtor with a tattered piece of credit. But you are a historian. You are a historian. So I want to know now, as a historian, Shashi, do you think the Hindu-Muslim divide in India, or the majority-minority community divide in India, has reached a point from where it can be brought back to where it was? Not a line of detonating powder, but a natural divide of historical lines with great cultural opportunities. Opportunities is what we've been talking about. Is there a possibility of this communal divide in India, which is being deepened and intensified by Hindutva? Is there, and by its opposite number? Because I must say the communalists on both sides are the greatest of friends by default, wanting the same goal. Is there a possibility, do you think, of India becoming not a wounded civilization, but a civilization that has overcome its wound? In your lifetime, mine is a passing story.
Well, I'm not that far behind you, I have to admit. So, no, but I am to that degree an optimist because I do believe that the essential nature of India, the India that I know, the India that I grew up in, the India I've kept coming back to, the India I chose to come back to when I had alternative choices, that India is still an inclusive India. And I do believe very strongly that that essence cannot be denied indefinitely. What we're seeing is a moment in which a certain polarization has sought to be stoked for political reasons. And the reasons are so obvious, it's almost amusing. The advent of identity politics in our country, which initially coalesced around caste identity. Some people had the bright idea of saying, why should we waste our time on things like caste when we've actually got 80% of our population belonging to Hinduism? If we whip up a frenzy on Hindus, even getting half of them is enough, and we'll win every election. That sort of thinking, I think, has led to a rather cynical and deliberate stoking of a sentiment which is in fact a fraudulent sentiment, because Hindus have never been a monolith, never will be a monolith, neither religiously, spiritually, nor socially or culturally. And I don't think that Hindus as a whole in this country will think of themselves think of their first loyalty, their primordial loyalties, as belonging to some sort of identity shaped by their religion. For that reason, I'm not a pessimist. However, I think we have to brace ourselves, all of us, for some more unpleasantness in the months to come, because there has been a correlation in the not so distant past between the advent of elections and the stoking of religious passions, even religious rioting, communal rioting, to put it bluntly. And that's indeed my worry. I mean, of course, one would think that the government of the day has a particular interest in showing its ability to preserve law and order, which may be the ultimate safeguard for us, that the nation need not descend into a frenzy of communal rioting, because after all, 21 of the states are ruled by the very party that's responsible in those states for law and order, and the country as a whole by a government that surely has the capacity to put down any serious rioting the moment it happens. But we have seen too many examples of the ruling party wishing to stoke up this kind of sentiment. And I must say that it's necessary for all of us who don't share this approach to stand up and speak up and stand against us to the extent we can. I'm not pretending that it isn't. In fact, it's far easier, I would say, to stoke violence, to ignite violence, than it is to dampen it. But this is a country that has a long experience of being able to deal with this kind of thing. And I'm hoping that we will be able to overcome it. And then certainly after the next elections, there will have to be a process of healing, which to my mind will require reaching out to those communities in this country that have been made to feel marginal, that have been made to feel less relevant, less central to the national project, and embrace them and say that you belong just as you always did, and that this was an aberration that will not be allowed to continue.
Thank you, Shashi. In the 1 minute and 10 seconds that we have before we open the discussion, I want to request you to comment on the National Citizenship Register issue, Assam.
Look, I think it's most unfortunate for all sorts of reasons. I understand what impelled the idea in the first place. I even understand that in 1985, when the Assam students' agitation was at its peak, that Rajiv Gandhi, as a prime minister then, felt it necessary to diffuse that crisis through an accord that essentially promised to deal with the illegal immigrants of that time and expel them. with a cut-off date of the Bangladesh War, so 1971. But 33 years later, to draw up a register that then proceeds to both disenfranchise and subsequently to cast the shadow or the threat of expulsion over people who have known no other home and no other country but India, is to my mind inhumane as well as arguably unsustainable in law.
Inhumane and arguably unsustainable in law is Shashi's comment on the NCR initiative in Assam. With that, we now open the discussion to the House. There must be a protocol which Kritika will familiarize us with.
Thank you, Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Gandhi. I'm sure everyone here has lots to think about now. Before we open the floor for questions from the audience, we have 2 questions for Dr. Tharoor from a contest that was run on social media. The first is from Nishant, who is in the audience today. Could somebody please hand him a mic?
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor
Hi.
Mr. Gandhi.
Hi.
My name is Nishant, and my question is to Dr. Tharoor on the current state of our Indian Parliament. So, sir, there has been a significant decline in the efficiency of our Indian Parliament.
I agree.
Whether we see the duration of our every session, it was around 120 in way back 1960-17, and now it has come down to 60 or 70 days. And
57 at last count.
And on many occasions, we have witnessed that even the opposition parties like UPA, there has been a significant, occasion where they do lot of walkouts. Even on the many occasions where there is a need of more debate, more constructive criticism of government policies. So, sir, how do we ensure, especially the political class of this nation, so that people continue to believe and have faith in our Indian Parliament? How we can ensure that?
It's an excellent question. I have answered it at some length in an article I'm particularly proud of, but that no one has noticed, perhaps because it appeared in a not very widely read magazine. And I would urge you as a young man to go on Google and find it. It's called The Crisis of Representation, and it appeared about a year and a half ago in Open magazine, so openthemag.com. And it's one of the few magazines that gives you the space to indulge in a lengthy analysis of an issue as complex as this, and I've done so. I think it's 3,000 or 4,000 words, so it's a fairly substantial piece, The Crisis of Representation. But broadly, we have a number of problems of which the duration of a session is only one of them. Certainly the duration of a session is an important problem because it's come down, and it's part of the, I'm sorry to use the word, but the contempt for the legislative process that we've already seen from the present Prime Minister when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, where the same thing happened to the Gujarat Legislative Assembly, and it's part of an approach which essentially sees the legislature as a necessary nuisance that for certain indispensable functions has to be resorted to, but mainly that exists in a parliamentary system merely to legitimize the government's existence. So you need a majority in the Lok Sabha to form the government. Once you form the government, who needs these MPs and their views? That's the attitude, and that's come right through. Second problem with this is, of course, the culture of disruption, which unfortunately is now very deeply entrenched. I remember before I came into politics, I was invited by the then Speaker, Somnath Chatterjee, to a round table of quote-unquote eminent citizens. There were 8 of us, including Mr. Narayana Murthy and a couple of other people like that, Shyam Benegal, the filmmaker. And we sat around a table with Somnath Chatterjee, and he said, what suggestions can you as citizens give us about how to improve the functioning? And even then he flagged disruption as a particularly severe problem. It's actually got worse. We've had entire sessions of Parliament disrupted because this is now deemed to be a legitimate parliamentary tactic, which of course it is not, and it is actually folly on the part of oppositions as well to disrupt because they deprive themselves of an opportunity to hold the government accountable. Third problem is the, sometimes the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The anti-defection law, which was passed for very good reasons, good and proper reasons, that people were just crossing the floor for benefits from the ruling party that were joining, and so the anti-defection law came in, but the provisions are so draconian that mere defiance of a party whip means that you can be expelled from Parliament, not just incur the opprobrium of your party. And as a result, parties in the last 30 years have basically made the whip a routine thing. It's not only for extremely important issues like confidence votes and so on. The whip is issued for every vote and every issue, with the result that essentially the idea of the parliamentary representative in the Burkean concept, if you've read Burke's famous speech to the electors of Bristol in 1770, in which he described the whole notion of parliamentary representation. He said to his voters, you voted for me, but once you have voted for me, you don't own me anymore. I decide on my best judgment what position to take in your name. And if you're not satisfied with my position, you can vote me out again. But while I'm there, you are voting for me to exercise my judgment, my thinking, and my education and my vision in your name. Now, that is gone now. So in the Indian Parliament, you are no longer essentially allowed to think. The party thinks for you, and all you can do is follow the party line. It's even worse, of course, if you belong to the ruling party, because the ruling party just mechanically gets its bills through in this way. And we've got to a point where even when parliamentary discussions take place in a constructive spirit, which is all too rare, even then they have no impact on the legislation, which fortunately was not the case in the days of the UPA. I remember Ghulam Nabi Azad bringing us some healthcare bill in which a doctor from the other side raised certain issues as a medical practitioner himself that he felt could improve the bill, and the health minister went back and changed the bill and brought amendments in that reflected these suggestions. This has never happened in the 4.5 years of BJP rule. To give you one example that happened to involve me, it's such a trivial matter, you'll laugh. There was a very routine bill which had first been drafted, I think even, or initiated anyway in the UPA's time, which says that every establishment of a certain size of employees will have to communicate the rights of the workers in writing to the workers. Perfectly reasonable bill, introduced by the Labour Ministry. And I think if you have more than 100 employees or whatever, you have to give all your workers what their rights are, their days off, their compensation, all of that in writing. Simple bill. I said, look, don't forget there's still, 30% of our population that may not be able to read and write. So my suggestion is that we should amend this marginally to say orally and in writing. So we convey to the workers orally what their rights are, and we also give them a document which, if it's written in very legal language, the workers may not understand, but you've told them orally what their rights are. I could see BJP members nodding in agreement while I was speaking. But when the time came to vote on my amendment, it was unanimously rejected by the BJP with their whip. Now, this kind of thing makes parliamentary discussions deeply frustrating. I know as an opposition MP, when I stand up to speak, that all I'm doing is speaking for the record. I will have zero impact on the bill I'm critiquing. I will have zero impact on the thinking of the government, because they've already done whatever thinking they intended to do. The decision is made. Parliament as a forum for deliberative discussion, for the formulation of policy and the passage of legislation in a meaningful sense, has ceased to be. It is now essentially a rubber stamp for the wishes of the ruling majority. And to my mind, all of that, not just the fact that we only met for 57 days last year, is a serious crisis of representation. Keep my answers short, I'm enjoined. You asked a question that required a long answer, but I'll keep the next one very short.
We'll now open the floor for questions from the audience. Please raise your hands. There are volunteers with mics who will come around. Please keep your questions short. We'd like questions, not comments. Thank you.
Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi, my question is born from curiosity, and I sincerely want you to know it is not coming from interrogation. Mr. Gandhi, I want to thank you for being very neutral in the way you asked questions. It's been very enabling for somebody like I, because you've been able to take a line of conversation which is neither supporting nor against what is. So, Mr. Tharoor, that really brings me to what I want to ask you. I've been a great admirer of yours, particularly in the book that you wrote about Why Am I a Hindu? And what I loved about it, and I wrote to you and you wrote back to me, was that you were willing to walk alongside people as they tried to discover their faith. And what was impressive about the book was that in the book, you are proud of being a Hindu, but not at the cost of rubbishing other religions, which means you haven't shrunk somebody else to promote Hinduism, which I think is a phenomenal way, because most often we try to rubbish somebody else to promote ourselves, which you haven't done. However, I am a little sad today because the first part of your conversation was a lot to do with what is wrong. And of course, towards the end, I did hear you say that there are things that we can do right. So what my question really is that I don't have much influence in the world that I live in, but in the spheres that I operate in, which is organizations, I recognize that all reality is co-created. Particularly in organizations, when leadership talks about what it wants done, it is a co-creation of the leader and the people who constitute that organization. So really my question to you is, Dr. Tharoor, and you, and more recently, Mr. Jairam Ramesh in his book about intertwined lives, I believe you're people who can make a difference to this country by bringing in a lot of positivity. You've come back to India after many years because I believe you have faith in this country. The question, yes, I'm just saying this, I'm sorry I asked. So anyway, the question really is this, what can you do for us, and can you help us to start looking at possibilities rather than what is going wrong?
That's a good question. First, I mean, I want to thank you for your kind words about my book, Why I'm a Hindu. And indeed, to my mind, the reason that I don't disparage other faiths is because, to my mind, Hinduism is all about acceptance. I've quoted in the book Vivekananda, Swami Vivekananda's famous statement in Chicago at the World Parliament of Religions, when he said, "I'm proud to speak to you on behalf of a faith which has taught the world not just tolerance but acceptance." And I read that as a teenager. It stayed in my mind. I've been thinking about it an awful lot because it seemed to me a particularly profound observation. The more I thought about it, the more profound it seemed to me. Because I went to school, as most of us here did, and learned that tolerance is a virtue, that a tolerant king, for example, is a good king because he accommodates others and so on. But when you really think about it, tolerance is actually a rather patronizing idea. Because tolerance says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. Whereas acceptance, which is what Vivekananda says Hinduism is all about, says, I believe I have the truth, you believe you have the truth, I will respect your truth, please respect my truth. And to my mind, that is the prescription. That is the prescription, not only in terms of religious coexistence with people of other faiths, but it's also the best way to conduct a democracy. I would like our democracy to function with mutual respect between the government and the opposition. I genuinely believe, from what I've seen of the previous government, and I was only in UPA 2, I was still at the UN during UPA 1, that a lot of effort was made to reach out to the other side and to do things cooperatively, which we have not seen mirrored in the last 4.5 years. There has been a peculiar complex on the part of this government, which has desisted from even wanting to take the opposition along with it on many issues on which the opposition might have been willing to collaborate. And now the result is a different sort of polarization, a political one, where neither party can stand the other, and that goes to personal, individual relationships as well, and where the desire to collaborate has essentially ceased to exist. Now, very clearly, if the election result after 2019 is a decisive one for one side or the other, the onus will be upon that victor to reach out to the other and say, look, we've gone through a very divisive time. For God's sake, let's work together in the interests of the country. I, for one, though I hope to be obviously on the victorious side, would be quite willing to take such an approach in the interests of the country as a whole. There's a lot that we can do that does not necessarily require us tearing each other down. But that hasn't been, I'm afraid, the attitude of our currently ruling party. The most egregious example of which was actually during the Indo-US nuclear deal, as we know from WikiLeaks, because the WikiLeaks cables demonstrated that just at the time when the BJP was opposing it tooth and nail, and even moving a vote of no confidence on that issue, they were in parallel at the same time assuring American envoys that they were only doing this because that was the rule of their conduct as an opposition party. They had to oppose it, but in private they were in favor, and the US had nothing to worry about if they came to power. Now, if that's the kind of approach you take, that you will not even act on your convictions, you will oppose only for the sake of opposing, even if your own convictions are on the other side, if you actually believe the government is right, then how on earth do you make any headway in this country? I certainly hope we will grow up after the next election, but I don't expect anything to be different in the next 6 months.
Good evening. Thank you here. See, repeatedly, in 30 years back, we have been importing Russian submarine, which never been inducted in Navy, 15,000 crores. And it's a second hand. It was the Congress rule. And now we are subsequently Bofors, now Rafale. So repeatedly we are importing our money, using our money. When we are going to do that, either Congress government didn't do that, and subsequently this government also not doing that, Indian made, for the defense. And we are importing our odd and exchange, you see the now flight of our money. So where we will be going? Thank you. Please answer.
So in the short term, I fear we have no choice but to import sophisticated weaponry, because the state-of-the-art weaponry that our defense forces require is not made in India. We have to get it from abroad. I certainly believe we need transparent procurement processes, and we should do things according to a universally accepted template and with processes that involve enough checks and balances that there should be no doubt about it. And that, unfortunately, has not happened in these examples you cite. But apart from that, for us to imagine that we can replicate all those defense systems overnight in India is impossible. But I would agree with you that we need to actually give a fillip, a stimulus to our domestic defense industry, both in the public sector, but given the limitations and inadequacies of the existing defense establishment, defense manufacturing establishment, we should also encourage the private sector to come in. That's how the US and France have built up their defense industries. Private companies often working in collaboration with government. And I think we should do the same in India so that we too have really good defense equipment and won't perhaps in a generation's time need to import them again. But for the foreseeable future, I'm afraid we have no way out but to continue doing this.
So, good evening, sir. I'm 18 David. So my question is, the MeToo campaign has recently sparked a pandemonium in India. So it's a classic case of David versus Goliath, wherein the Goliath is political bigwigs, including a union minister for the government. So what's you already tweeted about this. So what is the ideal justice from your perspective on this issue?
See, I think that there is I think it's wrong to see the issue as one of sexual relations alone. I think, to be honest, it's also about power equations. The cases that you've been reading about have all involved people in a situation of power differential, where whether it's an editor with a journalist, whether it's a movie producer or director with an actress, whether it's a person in authority over somebody who is anxious to please him and abuses that authority to take advantage of someone sexually. And in these situations, I think we as a society should be grateful that there has been this public ferment. I'm not suggesting that many of the things written about are actually violations of law. They may not be, but certainly because many of them occurred before even the sexual harassment law was passed in our country a few years ago. But they certainly involve ethical violations that society should confront. You know, in our country, we have had this peculiar problem that because we try and associate sex so much with shame, we tend to keep everything behind the curtain or under the carpet. And that means that even when abuse has taken place, our tendency has been to tell the victim, for her own good allegedly, to keep quiet and not make a fuss about it, because her honor will be besmirched. Well, it's high time, I think, that women rose up and said, this is wrong. The wrong was done by the man, and he shouldn't get away with it because society obliges me to stay silent. And I think to that degree, we have to absolutely accept that this was a necessary cleansing. I'm not pronouncing myself on any individual case, simply because some cases may be better founded than others. Some involve more serious violations of the other person's dignity and body space and so on than others do. And obviously the merits of each allegation, if anyone has to evaluate them, have to be evaluated in their own right. But to my mind, on the whole, the movement has helped us confront something which is happening all too often in our society, and where power is being abused. I stress it's about power. Power is being abused with impunity. So if there is no other punishment, shaming through social media is at least one form of punishment.
Excuse
Sorry,
me,
sir,
please.
unless you have a mic,
Excuse
I
me.
won't be
We
able to
just
hear
have
you.
time for one more question.
I don't mind taking one or two more if you feel there's so much
Yeah.
of Go ahead.
Hello.
Whoever has the mic.
Yeah, I have the mic. Yeah, I'm Bharat Shah. Now, my question to you, sir, is one, what is your stake on the uniform civil law, which is enshrined as a directive principle of our constitution, but remains there? It's not going forward. And connected to that is the matter of three talaq. Why is Congress opposing when it is giving equal rights to women, which is a kind of situation where the ladies have to get that right? Three, what is your stake on Babri Masjid, which is the kind of, the country burns on this issue, and it's so sentimental that we cannot talk from the top of the mind, but from the heart of the mind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for all three of those questions. Now I'm going to try to remember them in the right order. On the Uniform Civil Code, my view is that it is desirable, as indeed the directive principles stress, but that you can't get there by imposing it on the unwilling. That is, that it is a desirable objective to work towards with the consent of all who are affected. Which means who? Who are the ones who are really affected? The minorities who currently enjoy personal law are the ones who are affected, and we need to ask them if they're prepared to come along into this process. Don't forget that any dissenting member of a minority has the right to benefit from civil law. So, for example, if you're a Muslim, you have Muslim personal law governing marriage, inheritance, and divorce. But if you choose to marry under the civil law, you have the legal right under our system to do so. So actually, personal law is only observed by those who are willing to subject themselves to it. And I think, therefore, until they say that they would prefer a uniform code, it becomes difficult for any democratic government to impose a uniform civil code, though in theory and as an ideal, it's certainly a desirable objective for our civil society. Secondly, I think you asked about the
Triple talaq.
Triple talaq. Now, on the triple talaq issue, there were two concerns on the part of the Congress party. The first is, since the Supreme Court has already ruled that triple talaq is illegal, there is no need for a new law. And the second concern is that the new law sets an unusual precedent by criminalizing a civil offense. Now, we believe that the government has not fully thought through the implications of bringing criminal principles into what is essentially a civil problem. In fact, it is at a time when the Supreme Court itself is moving in the opposite direction by, for example, decriminalizing adultery. It's saying that it's a problem between a man and a woman, it's not a criminal matter. And similarly, when it comes to triple talaq, we wonder, for example, one of the consequences of criminalizing would be that the husband who pronounces triple talaq goes to jail. But the reason the woman doesn't want the husband to pronounce triple talaq may include that she needs him to continue supporting her. Now, if he's in jail, how does he support her? So, there are these things that the government, in its haste to score political points, appears to have overlooked, and so the Congress has asked for a debate and a discussion on the matter. On the Ram Janmabhoomi, as a Hindu, obviously, I'm very conscious that a vast majority of my fellow Hindus believe that was the specific birthplace of Ram. And for that reason, most good Hindus would want to see a Ram temple at the site where Ram was supposed to be born. But I also believe that no good Hindu would have wanted to see that temple built by demolishing somebody else's place of worship.
Good evening.
Is there time for one last question?
One last question
Kritika?
here.
Yeah.
Good evening, sirs.
That's a question.
Thank you very much for a terrific conversation.
I think, in all fairness, we should also allow a lady a question because we seem to have had a very gender balanced.
Thank you.
But go ahead, sir, go ahead and we'll ask the lady after you.
Yeah, so the question is the following. Where is the intellectual right in India? Why is it missing in action? I mean, you guys talked about a little while back the health of institutions and universities and the fitness or the lack thereof of people who have been appointed there, right? If you take a look at the US or any serious country, I mean, there is a robust tradition of both conservative and liberal thought. Whereas in India, I mean, you're soon confronted with Dinanath Batra, right? And then you have this long list of illustrious folks on the left. Is this something that has happened because of decades of whatever has gone on in the academy? And
well, it's a very good question, by the way, which has been asked for some time. Part of the problem is one would argue that a right wing in the internationally accepted sense of the term actually doesn't exist in India, because the right, for example, you mentioned America, the right in America has a coherent worldview that embraces, for example, a desire for minimal government, a desire for a very maximally free market, a desire linked at the same time to cultural conservatism, all of which go together as one package. Whereas in India, we have a cultural right, but that cultural right tends to be economically left. If you look at the RSS's economic philosophies as propounded by the Swadeshi Jagran Manch, they're far to the left of Nehru. I mean, they want complete protectionism. They want everything to be manufactured Swadeshi. They have said even if you must import, it can be silicon chips but not potato chips, all of this stuff. There is an entire sort of body of economic thinking which will disqualify the RSS and the conservative right in the Hindutva movement from being considered right-wing in an economic sense. The kind of coherent right-wing thinking that you see amongst the right in America has never really existed in India. We had the Swatantra Party of the late Rajaji, of which I must confess I was a strong sympathizer in my student days and still admire very greatly. And Rajaji's party had some very clear principles, which were both, you could call them liberal, you could call them conservative, because in those days both meant the same thing. They were principles that governed both issues of free market, relationship with Western countries during the Cold War, etc., down to a respect for social justice rather than socialism. And that could have been the nucleus of a genuine sort of Western-style conservative movement in this country. But as you know, the Swatantra Party died out in 1973 by merging, improbably enough, with Charan Singh's Bharatiya Kranti Dal, and that was the end of that. And the kind of intellectuals who existed in and around the Swatantra Party, people like Minu Masani and a few thinkers who published in Freedom First or in Swarajya, they essentially have more or less died out. There are a handful of them still writing in some publications, but the magazine that presumed to resurrect the label of Swarajya has turned out to be nothing but a shill for the BJP, and is no longer anymore a sort of center-right, conservative type publication. So this is the challenge in India, that we don't actually have a coherent, either a political vehicle that combines, for example, free market economics with cultural conservatism that falls short of bigotry and minority bashing. There is no such thing in this country. And therefore, the argument has tended to be amongst other forms of political organization. So at the national level, you've got the Congress, which is this big tent, broadly left of center, but embracing various views. And then you've got regional parties. But what is the ideological difference between, say, the Samajwadi Party, which translates as socialist, and the Congress Party? Or between the Samajwadi Party and the Trinamool Congress Party? Very difficult to actually lay down a set of ideological principles that would constitute an alternative to each other. They're simply organized around individual leaders or around individual states or caste identities or voter support bases. And it's in some ways tragic that our politics is divided that way, and I would trace the original sin to our freedom movement, because instead of dividing ideologically, our freedom movement chose to divide communally. And then both communal movements, or I shouldn't say that, the Muslim League as a communal movement and the remnant, the Congress, both claim to represent everybody. The Muslim League to represent all Muslims, and the Congress to represent all Indians. And those two were incompatible worldviews. But in the process, there was no real ideological contestation around the sets of principles that you might describe as conservative or liberal. And I think there was a lady who would ask for the mic. Yeah.
Dr. Tharoor, thank you very much for speaking up to allow me to ask my question. even in such spaces, we seem to be largely insensitive about smaller inequalities that has led to this toxic sort of environment we fester in. My question to you today is, the Congress has largely been invisible in Tamil Nadu for several decades now. And today, we have a defunct ruling party, which is completely undemocratic, and we have an opposition that's just recovering from a massive loss. So this is ideally an opportunity. Is the Congress taking notice of this? Do they have an idea, a vision, or at least an interest in our state?
Yes, of course, the Congress has a strong interest in the state. That last bit of your question kind of knocked me, because of course we're passionate about the state, and indeed, as you know, we have a number of our prominent political figures, and our recent political history is wrapped up completely in the state, and giants like Kamaraj Nadar for one, and others occupy a space in our imagination that Rajaji strode for 3 decades before that, and so on. So there is a long Congress history here. But it would be naive of us to pretend that the voters have not preferred, and all. The voters have gone for the Dravidian idea and its various manifestations, initially in 1, then in 2, and now in 5 or 6 different forms, which have therefore occupied much of the electoral space. Now, I don't believe the Congress is doomed to irrelevance, but in the short term, I think it seems inevitable that for electoral viability, the Congress is likely to collaborate with another party in order to also tap into the existing preferences of the Tamil Nadu electorate. So it doesn't mean that the Congress is writing itself off. On the contrary, the Congress believes it represents a set of ideas that are deeply valued in Tamil Nadu. And it needs to get those ideas across, and to do that it needs to stay politically viable in collaboration with others. But given the fact that we have this proud history, we are not about to abandon Tamil Nadu, I assure you.
Thank you, everybody. May I now request Dr. Tharoor and Mr. Gandhi to take their seats among the audience while we move on to the shortlist for the Hindu Prize. We now move to an important part of the evening's program, the announcement of the shortlist for the Hindu Prize 2018. Instituted in 2010, the prize has grown to be one of the most coveted in India's literary field. I would now like to introduce to you the jury members for the Fiction Prize. Paul Zachariah, an eminent Malayalam author and columnist. He is known for his nonconformist stance in political commentary and use of unconventional themes in fiction. The author of over 40 books, he has received many awards, including the Sahitya Academy Award. A.J. Thomas, an Indian English poet, author, translator, and editor. He was the editor of Indian Literature, the Sahitya Academy's journal, and is now its guest editor. His works have appeared in many national and international anthologies and publications. He is the recipient of many awards, including the Katha Award and the Vodafone Crossword Award. Radha Chakravarti, writer, critic, and translator. She is Professor of Comparative Literature and Translation Studies and Dean School of Letters at Ambedkar University, Delhi. She is known for her translations of Tagore's works and is currently translating the memoirs of Mahashweta Devi. May I request you all to take your seats on the stage. Unfortunately, 2 other members of this jury were unable to make it to Chennai this evening. Geeta Hariharan, who has written novels, short fiction, and essays over the last 3 decades, and whose work has been translated into a number of languages, and Arundhati Subramaniam, poet and writer, who has also worked as curator, critic, and poetry editor. I'd now like to request Dr. Zachariah to say a few words about the process by which they arrived at the shortlist.
Hello, everybody. It's my honor and pleasure to represent the jury of the Hindu Prize for Fiction in 2018. I take this opportunity to thank Mrs. Nirmala Lakshman and the Hindu Lit for Life team for inviting us to be members of the jury and thus to participate in this wonderful endeavor to promote literary imagination. I would like to say a few words about the books we read. The reading of over 100 works of fiction, with each juror picking up 20 to 30 titles, was a great journey of discovery for each one of us. It was a learning experience that gave us many insights into the way Indian fiction works in English as well as in English translations from mother tongues. Most importantly, we encountered in them a great polyphony that demonstrated how this nation is made up of a million different voices. About the shortlist itself, which is being presented today, the primary list or the long list covered works published between July 2017 and June 2018. The reading of these books took several months, and our exchange of views where it went through perhaps hundreds of emails amongst us. Our criteria had to be very flexible because of the mix of original works in English and of the English translations from the mother tongues. And also because of the range of the works in terms of period, theme, and approach. When the reading was done, each juror shared with others a selection of titles, which he decided were the best among the lot. We pooled these lists and worked out an integrated list of titles that received the most number of votes from each juror. And that is the shortlist being presented here today. Needless to say, there is no final word on literature. Evaluations of literature, such as we have done in our sittings, are objective in their operative plane and subjective in our individual responses to individual imaginations of various authors. Finally, the names in the shortlist are, that is when it's being read out, the names in the shortlist are not arranged in any order of preference, but alphabetically by author's first name. Thank you.
May I now request Dr. Tharoor to please come up on stage and announce the shortlist.
All right, the Hindu Literature Prize for Fiction 2018 is a short list of 6 books, and as my friend Paul Zacharias said, they're in the order of the author's first names. 1, Half the Night is Gone by Amitabh Bakshi. A Day in the Life, Stories by Anjum Hassan. All the Lives We Never Lived by Anuradha Roy. Requiem in Raga Janki by Neelam Saran Gaur. Punachi by Perumal Murugan. The Aunt Who Wouldn't Die by Shirshendu Mukhopadhyay. I should have mentioned the Perumal Murugan book is translated from the Tamil by N. Kalyanaraman, and The Aunt Who Wouldn't Die is translated from the Bengali by Arunava Sinha. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I now request the jury to take their seats in the audience? This year, the Hindu has introduced another category for the Hindu Prize, non-fiction. Entries were invited in a variety of genres: biography, memoirs, autobiography, travel writing, history, arts, culture, polity, economy, investigative journalism, reportage, environment, and ecology. And to introduce the jury that had the unenviable task of arriving at a shortlist from this mix, Kamini Mahadevan, who's had a long and exciting innings in publishing. She was with Penguin Books India for almost 2 decades and retired as consultant editor. Responsible for the quasi-academic, non-fiction, Penguin Classics, and translations lists, she's had the privilege of publishing several eminent and award-winning authors. Chandan Gowda, a faculty member at Azim Premji University, Bangalore, he compiled and edited The Way I See It, a Gauri Lankesh reader, which has been translated into Hindi, Kannada, Malayalam, Tamil, and Telugu. He has translated U.R. Anantamurthy's novella, Bara, and is presently completing a book on the history and cultural politics of development in Old Mysore. Harsh Sethi was the consulting editor of Seminar for over 20 years. He worked briefly with Sage Publications as acquisitions editor and was earlier deputy director of the Indian Council of Social Science Research and a fellow at the Center for Studies in Developing Society. Rustam Bharucha is the author of several non-fiction books on diverse areas of research like performance, interculturalism, globalization, secularism, and oral history. He recently retired as professor of theatre and performance studies in the School of Arts and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University and is in the process of completing a new book on the Ramayana co-edited with Paula Richman. Shiv Vishwanathan, public intellectual and social scientist, best known for his contributions to science and technology studies. A trained social anthropologist, he is currently professor at Jindal Global Law School, Sonipat, and director, Center for the Study of Knowledge System, OP Jindal Global University. May I now invite the jury onto stage, please. I'd now like to invite Kamini Mahadevan to say a few words about how this jury arrived at their shortlist.
Good evening, Dr. Tharoor, Mr. Gandhi, and friends. It is a great pleasure and honor for us to be on this jury of the newly launched Hindu Lit Prize for Nonfiction. Some of the most exciting writing in the country at present is happening in the field of nonfiction. And the readership for such writing has been growing rapidly. Leading English language publishers are in fact publishing over twice as much nonfiction than fiction in recent years. The emergence of a general audience curious and interested in engaging works that reflect on issues of culture, history, politics has even led many academics to reorient their scholarly writing towards a non-academic readership. It is to the credit of the Hindu, and especially, may I say, Dr. Nirmala Lakshman and her team, to have recognized the creative importance of nonfiction writing in contemporary times and instituted the Hindu Lit Prize for Nonfiction. A valuable feature of this prize is that it recognizes powerful nonfiction works written in English as well as in Indian languages. The Hindu therefore solicited submissions of English language translations of creative nonfiction done in any of the languages of the country. We are delighted to note that the books in our pool of submissions this year included 8 translations, namely from Bengali, Hindi, Punjabi, Kannada, Urdu, and Malayalam. Should a work of translation win the prize will be split equally between the author and the translator. Both are so important to the whole process of creation. Now to come to the judging process. Nonfiction is a complex animal. It cuts across genres. In the books submitted for the jury's consideration this year, we encountered stirring memoirs, biographies, both written and oral histories, critical writing on foreign policy, law, gender, caste, and ecology, among others. Comparing such a variety of writings in order to arrive at the shortlist was challenging and stimulating for the five of us. The time span of the jury evaluation process, from the receipt of the books to declaring the winner, is almost 9 months, enabling a close reading of the texts and extensive discussions between the members of the jury. The Hindu called for submissions from English language publishers in April this year, and to be considered for the 2019 Hindu Lit Prize for non-fiction, the books ought to have been published between June 2017 and June 2018. The translations of works of non-fictions from regional languages too should have been published during this period, though the original work could have been published in the past 50 years. After reviewing the submitted books, there were over 90 such books this year, the jury members shared their top 5 titles among themselves in early September. We gave ourselves a month to give close attention to the titles that had not featured in any of our lists, and spent 2 days earlier this week to arrive at the final shortlist that will be announced today. We looked for books that opened new worlds, invented new styles, and proved memorable. Also for books that spoke to the predicament of our times in compelling ways. Above all, we sought to shortlist books that have a potential for a shelf life and will continue to enhance our critical understanding of a subject. The books the jury shortlisted have met many of these expectations. We hope that the Hindu Lit Prize for non-fiction serves to further encourage the writing and publication of imaginative non-fiction works and contributes to the enrichment of our intellectual life. Thank you.
May I now request Mr. Gopal Krishna Gandhi to come onto stage and announce the shortlist.
Shortlist of non-fiction 2018 in alphabetical order. Manoranjan Vyapari, Interrogating My Chandal Life. Shudeep Chakravarti, The Bengalis. Anchal Malhotra, Remnants of a Partition. Jairam Ramesh, Indira Gandhi, A Life in Nature. Srinath Raghavan, The Most Dangerous Place.
Thank you, everybody. The winners for both the prizes will be announced at the Hindu Lit for Life on January 13th, 2019. The festival will take place over 3 days, January 12th, 13th, and 14th. We hope to see you all again there. Have a good evening.